All right. Hello there, everybody. Welcome to Compassion Works for All and our first Tuesday conversation. We are here with Carmen Alonso and Dan Groupie, and you guys are affiliated with the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm really excited about this conversation. We've not had an academic version of a First Tuesday conversation. In some ways we have, but not just full on, let's talk research, let's talk what all of that side looks like when it comes to mindfulness and meditation. So I'm really excited to have you guys here. Carmen and Dan, thank you all so much for creating some time to join us and to share a little bit about your work and what you do. Carmen, I would love to just start with you and just find out what your work is and how you went about getting into it.
Sure. Well, thank you for having us. And let me just be clear that the master academic is Dan. He is the guy in terms of the science for meditation. In terms of my job, I'm a clinical psychologist. I see individual clients, and my passion, though, is more doing group work. And I have been teaching mindfulness for the last maybe 20 years by now, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for people who struggle with depression and anxiety. And the last few years where my passion is, it's in the creation of what you see here, just mindfulness, which is to bring mindfulness offerings to people who may not have access easily to some of these offerings, to people who may not have a voice at the different tables. So for that, I am working in prisons, and I'm loving bringing mindfulness to prisons. And there are actually three offerings. One is the regular mindfulness groups that we do twice a month in different prisons. One is the Path of Freedom curriculum that we bring to different groups too. And the third one, that is more recent for me, but I'm really loving the curriculum, and I certainly want to continue to explore that. It's the restorative justice circles in prisons. So I learn so much every time I go to the prison, and I leave the prison usually inspired, brokenhearted, humble, and grateful. Mm-hmm. And another piece of my job is I'm a martial arts instructor, and I also bring the mindfulness into the teaching of Taekwondo specifically. Okay. So I don't know if you wanted anything else, but that's where I would start.
No, that's fantastic. And the Path to Freedom, is that from the Prison Mindfulness Institute group?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fleet Mall, yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm familiar with that. That's fantastic. Well, that's great. How did you go about getting into this work?
Well, I was teaching mindfulness classes at the university for several years, and it felt a little bit sterile in a way. I think that's the best word that comes to mind. It felt like it was mostly groups of white educated people, and it was great. I mean, I love the work because I love teaching mindfulness regardless, but the whole piece around diversity, and as you can all tell, I mean, I have an accent, so I'm from Spain, so living as an immigrant here, I feel like, all these voices, all this is not enough diversity in here. And that's why I started exploring what else is possible. And I actually, honestly, I applied for the manager position at the UW Mindfulness program. I didn't get it. And now I understand why I didn't, because the whole admin part, I don't like at all. And that's when I first step into the prison, is like, this is where I needed to be. So yeah. Then there is a whole piece too with police officers, but Dan is much more articulate than I am, and he can talk about that part.
Okay, excellent. Man, thank you so much for sharing that. And I do, here in just a moment, I would love to hear more about that diversity aspect. But first, Dan, I'd like to kick it over to you and just let you introduce yourself. Tell us what you do, how you got into your work, and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, thank you, Corey, for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Um, so I am a scientist at the Center for Healthy Minds. That's a research center at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Um, we have faculty from a number of different departments on campus, a strong emphasis on psychology and neuroscience research, but we also have researchers who are in the humanities, in religious studies, the School of Human Ecology, counseling psych, educational psychology. So kind of a diverse group of researchers, all of us under the same mission of promoting the reduction of suffering and improved well-being through an increased scientific understanding of the mind. So that's our kind of our mission statement. How can we better understand the mind and the brain in order to promote well-being and reduce suffering? I'm a psychology researcher by training. I have training in psychology and neuroscience methods. Um, my background was really focused a lot more on basic neuroscience, and I did a lot of work on the neuroscience of anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress. And during my dissertation, started to do a little bit of work with veterans, and we were doing a brief mind-body intervention, which actually Carmen was one of the instructors for this class. So I've known Carmen for a long time and worked with her a little bit then. And doing that training, that intervention research with veterans was really um, kind of a life-changing experience for me. It was pretty transformational where I saw the suffering that these men and women had carried for a long time um, from the stress and the trauma that they had experienced and that they continued to carry for years and years. And in this brief intervention, which was very different from what they were receiving at the VA, where the focus is on medications and exposure therapy, instead tuning into themselves, into the wisdom of their body and their minds, and developing a different kind of awareness and relationship to their emotions. I saw transformation in some of these folks and thought this is a direction that I want to go in my work. So I really started to shift then from doing more basic neuroscience and psychology research to investigating the scientific basis of some of these mind-body practices and how these kinds of practices could be delivered not just to treat symptoms of anxiety and stress and trauma, but maybe even to be used more preventively and proactively for populations that might be exposed to high levels of trauma or stress and hopefully prevent some of these disorders. And that's the work that I've been doing for the last 8 years or so at the Center for Healthy Minds. I did postgraduate training there and then took a scientist position and have been involved in one project, a line of work that Carmen mentioned with police officers adapting and delivering and studying the impact of an adapted mindfulness training program for police officers here in Madison. And I was able to reconnect with Carmen through that project. And she was one of the teachers for that work and continues to be one of the teachers for that work. So we've been doing that for about the last 5 or 6 years, developing relationships and carrying out a few different studies with police officers. And I'm just kind of starting to dip my toes into the world of corrections and thinking about how some of these practices might be delivered and also scientifically investigated to address unmet mental health needs of people who are incarcerated and trying to reenter the community after incarceration.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so fascinating. And the idea of merging science together with contemplative practices just it gets me so excited. I would love to hear from both of you really about this work with police officers. That's an area that Compassion Works for All is also starting to dip our toe into. And on the one hand, you know, if you've been involved in work on the nonprofit sector, working with people who are incarcerated, it's almost like we can't go help the other side. You know, we can't go over and offer these things to the people that are inflicting this trauma on the people we're trying to serve. But so I'm just curious what your experiences have been, and especially what you've learned about specifically about communicating mindfulness to a population like law enforcement officers. I would love to hear either one of you start talking about that.
I'll just offer my 2 cents on that, but I learned really quickly that offering mindfulness groups to police officers, it needs to be in a different way. It needs to be in a different way. It needs to be more focused on the stress of their work. I mean, well, wait a minute. First, maybe the most important thing that I learned is that the offerings always need to be done co-facilitated by a police officer, somebody who knows the territory from the inside, because I don't. So I go in there as a non-officer, and it is important to talk about the stress of the job, to go too quickly, which is a mistake that I have done more than once, into emotions. I mean, there is a training, and that's something actually that the study that Dan was talking about before with veterans is like there needs to be a back door to go into the emotions. They cannot just go like this, because it's just not the way their minds have been trained. So it just needs to be different. It's an amazing, resilient group of folks and who are suffering a lot. So it's about how can we address also the trauma that may have experienced from a mindfulness-based perspective, so that they don't carry that and the ripple effects of that onto other people. So I have really enjoyed. I've been puzzled many times about how they may respond to a particular element of the curriculum in a different way again than perhaps other groups. And I'm still learning, and I have so much to learn, but the dedication that many of them have to serve their communities better, and their commitment, I mean, it's really remarkable. So I have really enjoyed working with them.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love that idea that you can't just go straight into that emotional state or get into those things, that there's you've got to communicate it in a way that they're ready to hear and ready to receive. And especially to have someone who is in the law enforcement world alongside you, if for no other reason, just for credibility. I think that's often been my my biggest glaring weakness, is just not knowing what that looks like, what that feels like to wear a badge, to wear that uniform, and to know everything that goes into it. I really appreciate that. And Dan, have you found commonalities especially in the neuroscience side of people in law enforcement and the people who are incarcerated? I mean, are there things that you're like, my goodness, these match up? Are there ways that you see they're polar opposites? Like, what has the research shown you in that world?
So, I've just started doing research very, very early stages with populations that are incarcerated. So I don't think I feel like I'm not really in a position to answer that question. I did, and I'll come back and maybe try to answer it a little bit, but just kind of following up on what Carmen was saying about working with this population. One of the things we did early on in working with officers was we had our teachers go on ride-alongs, and I went on a bunch of ride-alongs myself to start to try to understand that landscape just a little bit at least. And we had one officer share with us, and he was somebody who collaborated and did some co-teaching with us, and he talked about something we observed on those ride-alongs was that these police officers have a tremendous amount of expertise in situational awareness of their external environment. That this is, they're world class at having this very finely, acutely tuned, this attentional muscle that they've flexed so much, and this external vigilance and ability to both the breadth of attention that they bring to their work, but also the ability to then focus in and really hone that attention in and to flex between those things. So this is a skill that that sounds very familiar, probably, if you have a mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
That police officers, I think, are really accustomed to directing toward their external environment. what this officer shared with us is what police officers are not used to doing is taking that same quality and scope of attention and turning it inward and having that kind of internal situational awareness. And Carmen kind of spoke to this resistance or just unfamiliarity or unwillingness to go inside and to be with emotions that are really challenging, emotions and memories related to trauma that they've experienced, that they've seen, that their colleagues have borne witness to. And I think to a large extent that tendency to avoid and to suppress and kind of push away and not acknowledge that trauma and to really cope with that trauma in a more productive way. I think that unresolved, unacknowledged trauma is not just at the root of personal suffering, but is really tied up in the suffering that other communities, that communities of color, that marginalized groups too often experience in encounters with law enforcement. So that's really the motivation behind a lot of this work with policing, is finding a way to, I think, address that unresolved trauma in a way that it can transform not just those individuals, but hopefully also the work that they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really well said. And in a lot of ways, transforming it from the inside out rather than screaming loud enough to make changes happen, actually coming from within. Do y'all find, I just used an Arkansas word, y'all, do y'all find that police officers in general are willing participants in your programs? Do they come into it kind of begrudgingly? How does that, what is the vibe there?
Yeah. Madison's an interesting city and an interesting police department. Madison is a very progressive city in a less progressive state overall, but the city of Madison and the Madison Police Department kind of have a history and a reputation of trying stuff that's a little bit more cutting edge and maybe a little bit more out there than other police departments have done. And there is a wonderful, incredible Dharma teacher and police officer, Captain Sherry Maples in the Madison Police Department, who's a teacher in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, who introduced some of these practices from inside to the police department.
Wow.
About 30 years ago, honestly, before they were ready, I think. She was ahead of her time in bringing these practices and kind of planting some seeds in some ways for the work that 25 or 30 years later we came along and started to do from a research standpoint. So I think owing to the more progressive nature of the department and some of the groundbreaking work that Sherry had done years before, the Madison Police Department has one of the highest percentages of female officers of any department in the country. They have a really high percentage of college-educated officers. So just from what we know, that actually Carmen kind of spoke to before about the demographics of people who tend to, at least in the Western world, engage in these sorts of practices. It was, I think, relative to other police departments, a little bit more receptive group. And that being said, there's still resistance. I think that, I know that that Carmen and the other teachers encountered in the classroom. And also up until this point in all the work that we've done, the trainings have been fully voluntary. Okay. So officers have been able to sign up. They're not told by their supervisor that they have to do this. It's not a mandatory training. And we've probably about 20% maybe of the police department at this point has received one of our 8-week trainings. And toward the end of the last research study we did, it started getting a lot more difficult to recruit people. It kind of felt like we were running up against our limit in terms of the number of people who were really interested in voluntarily signing up for this. So of the group that has actually made it to the classroom, I think because of the teachers we have, I think because of the experiences where they've gone out and gotten to know a little bit what this work is like, and brought that, both demonstrated a little bit of cultural competency in the classroom, but also demonstrating their humility and acknowledging the limitations of what they know. I think that kind of attitude that they've brought into the classroom and just their skill as teachers, as far as, if we get people into the classroom, I think we've had a lot of success and
Okay.
not as much resistance. But a big part of this is just like, how do you actually get people in the door?
Yes, I can imagine that would certainly be the case. And my bias is always, no, this is so good. Like this material, you're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. And maybe some people do, maybe some people don't. But yeah, that's I can connect with that feeling of if you'll just get in the door, I think this would be good. But I think it's also really important to have well thought out presentations that you're making. Oh, that's so fascinating. Carmen, you mentioned in your biography that you sent over to us that you have spent some time teaching mindfulness in Spanish-speaking cultures. And you had mentioned earlier just diversity in general. And I'm wondering if there are some underlying guiding principles that you take with you whenever you go into diverse cultures to teach mindfulness.
Yeah, well, a couple of those reminders is one, I try to talk less and listen more.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the past, years ago, it's like I would go, okay, whether it's MBSR or MBCT, whatever mindfulness-based intervention it would be, I kind of like went with the curriculum under my arm. Okay, we're doing this. And now with more and more experience, you realize like, whoa, people really need to take it in different ways depending on where they are at. So that would be the second principle that I remind myself, to being really open to see, okay, this group, what would be the best way to kind of like start exploring this territory for them, with them. And that's a tone, actually, that curiosity that I often really, when I end one of the mindfulness-based interventions for police officers, I always think it's like, okay, we need to think about this further, about this element and how to make it more relevant, because somehow there are some of the teachings that don't seem to land into the heart at times. With the Spanish-speaking population, I just did a retreat, a 5-hour retreat this last Saturday, which was really lovely. And the reminder there was again to be much more open, and the sensitivity that, some people from this community was a pretty humble community. They may able to be in the class for a little bit because then they need to go and attend to the kid or go to work or come back late or the phone didn't work. And just the permissiveness and the all-encompassing tone that the mindfulness practice itself has. Yeah. It's all welcome here, we often say. So I think trying to embody that in all layers of in all the relational layers, really, of whoever it is that I'm exploring with. That's a big reminder lately. And I love it because there's always a more relaxed stance within myself. And that it's all okay. Oh, there is like on Saturday, there's an 84-year-old lady who's falling asleep. And how sweet that for some of it, she attended to this. And it's all okay, and she was very grateful at the end. And that's all great. So just I love that different way, and the people, and what touches one person doesn't touch the other, and what works, that's a strange word, but what really resonates and what doesn't for people. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. That's so good. And you're clearly the joy that you get out of it is clearly coming forward. I'm curious if in working with various populations, what you have learned or what you've added to your practice from, in addition to this openness and this joy. Like, are there tools or skills or things that you've gone, hey, I actually learned this from this group or that group?
Oh, well, there is so much, Corey, that I learned from people, but the listen deeply. And my mind just went back to one time teaching in one of the prisons. I do mindfulness now. We just started with Path of Freedom, but with a group of inmates who are in segregation. And this is a prison that used to be a supermax. Mm-hmm. So according to some, the most violent criminals, these words are so strange, in Wisconsin are there. And I go to segregation. And I was teaching a lesson, and there I can only have 6 residents because there are 6 stools and they are shackled to the stool as we do this mindfulness. And it's all about being aware of the present moment, right? Who wants to be aware of the conditions that they are in? But that day I was teaching on communication and patterns of speech, patterns of listening. And there was one guy who always sat there on the corner. And I'm talking about, mindful listening and all these things. And then the two of them, the other one on the other corner, and the 2 of them start talking. And to me, I experienced that as they were constantly interrupting each other. And I said, wait a minute. We are talking about mindful listening. And it seems to me like you guys are constantly interrupting each other. And at that moment, that lesson I will never forget. And this guy, he says, "No, this is all cool. This is the way we do it." And they were Black men, and they educated me so eloquently about what a biased perspective I had on what is, mindful communication, because it doesn't work like that. And when I explore more with them, but doesn't it feel disrespectful? No, well, it depends. And they have the whole explanation about how, no, you can talk in this way and it doesn't, and sometimes it does, and they would give me clear examples. So I'm trying to also be more aware of my whiteness, yes, with this accent from a lady from Spain, but what is my condition, and that I'm bringing into the interactions with the groups, and that for that I just have to be curious and listen. Mm-hmm. And I always learn so much.
Yes. And the idea of seeing our own whiteness is, I think that's something more and more of us are growing in, an understanding of the need for it. And Dan, I'm curious how you navigate that. You mentioned in your bio that you are you're gravitating toward a community engaged perspective and trying to understand the needs of the community you're serving as you go about doing your research, as you guys go about doing your programs. I'm curious what that entails for you, how you understand the needs, and then how you kind of remove this white saviorism that a lot of us can approach programs like this with, but then how you also do that without dumping the full responsibility of the people who are being served. Like that's a weird kind of balancing act to try to do. So I'm just curious, how do you do it?
There's so much in there, and I don't think I can unpack all of it. And I don't know is like the.
Well, I was hoping you could tell me because
I can try to give the little bits of knowledge that I have, but actually that answer I don't know is really central to it.
Yeah.
And that's I have a colleague who has really encouraged me over time, and a mentor here who's encouraged me. It's something that as academics feels very uncomfortable to us, or like threatening to admit the limitations of our knowledge. But going in with a sense of not knowing in beginner's mind into this work is the most valuable stance that I can take as a scientist. Mm-hmm. I don't need to try to impress people with my credentials and my knowledge and my publications and my degrees and things like that. Those are impediments, I think, to connecting with actual people who inhabit the real world and not the rarefied air of academia. So so that being said, that I don't know, I I think I definitely, this evolving stance that I have toward community engagement came out of work with law enforcement. And I think it came from starting that work with the best of intentions, and this intention that by training police officers in skills of mindful awareness and compassion, that would be of benefit for the community. It would be of benefit for marginalized groups who kind of have the most to gain from improved interactions with law enforcement. And I just kind of assumed that other people would see it the same way. And I assumed that it was enough to do this training with law enforcement, and by bettering their mental health and allowing them to have less stress and sleep better, that it was kind of going to be a rising tide that would lift all boats and everybody would be happy with this. And when I encountered criticism from individuals in the community who weren't so enthusiastic about this work and weren't so enthusiastic about me leveraging institutional resources and my knowledge and my time to directly benefit police because I thought it could indirectly benefit other people, I reacted to that with a lot of, I think, defensiveness and, well, I'm doing this for the right reasons and I'm doing this because I want to help you. So I think in retrospect was an attitude that was very much grounded in that white saviorism that you're talking about. And it was through through Carmen's work largely, and hearing her talk about the work that she was doing with incarcerated populations, that I became really interested in kind of shifting the focus of my work, continuing to work with law enforcement, but also working with a different group of people who are affected in a very different way by the criminal justice system. And I was really fortunate as I started talking with a colleague about research around this area, that I also connected with a few different people and resources that were really influential. One is the Mind and Life Institute. I don't know if you're aware of Mind and Life.
No, I'm not.
So this is an organization that supports science and scholarship more broadly that's connected to contemplative sciences and contemplative studies. And I went to a summer research institute a few years ago that the Mind and Life Institute holds. And really the emphasis and focus of that institute was on a more engaged form of scholarship, and not doing academic research that could trickle down to benefit people, but really engaging in the world and in the community, and stepping outside of the comfort of the institution to do work that can be of direct benefit. So that was a really foundational experience for me. Our university has an Office of Community Engaged Research and Teaching. I was able to do a year-long program through that institute as well, just to kind of do some foundational learning. And there's some great books and articles I can recommend on engaging with community groups in a way that is in which you can share power, in which you can not come from this perspective of saviorism, but instead turning to the community and asking them to teach me instead of me dumping my knowledge on them. Through all of this, we've started to do work. To take a little step back, this colleague that I was working with, as we were thinking about how can we develop a mindfulness-based program to benefit people who are in correctional settings, the way that we started that work was the way that we always as scientists start work. We had an idea, we thought it was really great, we wrote a grant, we submitted it to a federal agency, we thought it sounded really good. The feedback that we got from that agency was essentially, have you talked to anybody, you talk about wanting to help all these people through this work, how have you engaged them? Like, how have you involved them in this process? Using the language of stakeholders, like what stakeholders have you engaged and how? and we hadn't really at all. And we've kind of now gone back to the drawing board, and partly through relationships that Carmen has developed over time, the work that she's been doing in prison settings, we were able to connect with a community group here in Madison that does a lot of work around corrections and reentry. And we were able to engage this community group as co-partners in the work as we really strip the whole thing down and start from the foundation of what do people who are incarcerated or who have been incarcerated, what do they actually need? Yep. What are they actually asking for?
Yeah.
And not assuming that we have the answer to the question. We don't even know necessarily what the right question is to be asking. So that's the stance that we've been adopting as we've started doing this research, is turning to community wisdom, to people who have been there, who have lived experiences, and not even presuming the answer or the question before we start the work, but instead turning to them for what are the questions that we should be asking? How can we leverage these resources and this privilege and this power that we have within this institution in the best way?
Yeah. Oh, and that last part that you said, especially that hit me in the gut. Not even presuming to know the questions, because that if you control the questions, and you control the narrative, and so even letting go of that need to be able to say, okay, answer these questions for me because this is what I want to know. Recognizing that still coming from a place of me being in control of this thing.
Yeah. And that's as this project has unfolded that we're doing, and this project is engaging groups of men and women who have been incarcerated in a series of focus groups, essentially, or conversations. Even as we had adapted this kind of stance of doing this work differently, within those sessions, I could still see in myself, and maybe Carmen can speak to this, I don't know, this attachment to these questions that we came up with for how we thought these conversations should go, and then frustration when people's answers were to different questions that we hadn't asked. And even with the intention of going in and turning to community wisdom, it still keeps showing up until eventually, I've been able to realize, maybe these folks are not asking maybe what they need is not an adapted mindfulness intervention to address mental health. Maybe it's something much larger or much broader or more encompassing than that. It's really, really hard to let go of that power.
Yeah.
When you're so used to having it in the way that
absolutely.
You live your life.
And especially if, like you were saying earlier, with the working with law enforcement, when it's coming from what you believe to be a sincere place and something that you see as a positive and as something that's going to be of benefit for people, in my mind, then why doesn't everybody want it? But letting go of that, and not just in a way that I was a pastor for a number of years. And in white progressive churches, we talk about diversity all day long. But what we don't do is hire people of color to be the lead pastors or to preside over the worship and the music. And so we don't bring the actual culture in. We just want the bodies with different skin tones sitting in the pews so that you can check that diversity mark. And it becomes much more about tokenism than actual incorporating and following the views, the perspectives, the understandings, the theologies, all of it. And so I think that's a difficult thing to avoid, getting that perspective just so you can check that box, but actually allowing it to dictate where you're going and how you're getting there. Is that thing that we like to at least have one hand on that rein. Carmen, it looked like maybe you're going to jump in and say something about that.
Well, I just want to say just a word about this project that Dan was talking about, because it has been so fascinating. And throughout the years, I have collaborated with different people from the university doing just my little piece, the mindfulness offering. But I have not been collaborating with people like Dan and the colleague that he is referring to in a way that has been so respectful to the community that we are working with. So it has been so clear that we all went, and I was there too, with all the questions that we needed to ask, the men and the women. And then there's like, wait a minute. Somebody actually from this group pointed out really quickly that sometimes us white folks may go with the importance of the agenda,
Yeah.
whereas the priority may be more the relationship. So myself, I don't know about you then, but myself, from that moment on, I felt like, oh, wait a minute. I worked with my own attachments to that agenda because I wanted to do what the researchers wanted with those two groups, you know? And once that was so clear, then yes, I was attached in this way. And the most important thing were the relationships that we were developing with these two groups of men and women. Then it just all has a flow. And yes, it's what Dan says, you know, the realization that maybe, oh, I was looking too into a mindfulness-based intervention, and it's just maybe something much wider that we're talking about that will be most beneficial.
Yes.
And I just have to say, Dan, but you have really done just an exquisite job from your perspective as a researcher to listen and to hear the input that we were bringing from the groups and just really listening, and then go with that. So it's been a joy to work in this project too.
It's been so instructional for me. What Carmen talks about, these relationships, and that's for doing authentic work and work that actually matters and can make a difference. It's so foundational, and you can't short circuit that step. You might get to the next step a little bit faster. We might get funding a little bit quicker because we've answered our questions and we've checked the boxes and we've gotten there. But it's built on a shaky foundation, and I really deeply believe that if that's where we start, with relationships that are built in trust and that are built in shared power and shared decision making, everything else will flow from that. And I've seen how that's already started to happen, and how those relationships then facilitate more relationships. And as you develop trust, you're allowed into a network of people who are all working toward the same end that we're also working to, just from a different perspective.
Yes, and how one influences the other, because you mentioned funding. That's always, I mean, as a director of an organization, that's always front and center of how do we keep the lights on? How do we keep these things running? And so there is that fear of, if I don't do what the grant providers are asking, if I try to prioritize relationships over giving a cool spreadsheet with all the great things we accomplished in our last class, if I move that direction, then I risk losing funding. But what it seems to be doing right now, though, the tide seems to be shifting to where enough people, even in the grant making world, are recognizing that this is what organizations are starting to do, and we're seeing more value in that and shifting. So I don't know if it's a dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog, but it does seem that it eventually becomes this flow where everybody starts to go, oh, aha, this is actually really good, and just kind of trusting that maybe things aren't going to be easier, but at least it's your work is going to be much more valuable. And it also just reminded me of we do weekly programs at a women's shelter just down the street from our office. And one of the very first weeks we were there, we were just talking about how when we ruminate about things, when we just keep playing things from our past or having anxiety over the future, we can create a lot of stress in ourselves. So we were just asking, what do you guys find yourself just thinking about all the time? And this lady said, I need a job. And it was kind of like, oh, yeah. So not about where you're going to eat lunch tomorrow, not like you need a job, and us sitting here talking to you about mindfulness is helpful. Yeah. But really, if you had a job, you would be in a better position to go through a program on mindfulness. And so recognizing how wide those needs actually go out, listening and paying attention to that, and trying to place ourselves in a position where we can actually address suffering in all the various forms that it takes.
And this is like the greatest tension for me that's emerging in this work, where when we're asking people in these groups, what do you want? What they're saying is this whole system and structure is broken and it needs to change. Yeah. And that's what we need. And that's what's at the root of all of this suffering. Are you willing to work to challenge that?
Yeah.
How much do you want to stay in your lane? How much are you willing to take on that fight? Yeah. And I think that the short answer for me is like, we need to do both. We need to address, proximal, like what is causing you suffering? How can we help you right now in this moment? But we can't ever lose sight of what's at the root cause of this suffering, and what are we doing to address that? Otherwise, we're not, I think, truly engaged in this work.
Okay. Well, I had that question on my list, but I didn't know we were going to go that far with it. I'm so glad. I do want to, we have a few folks on the live call with us, so I wanted to be sure if there's anything that Sandy, Anna, or Stella, if there's anything that you guys wanted to be sure and bring up or say to Carmen or to Dan. I'd love to give you the opportunity to do that now. You can feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in there if you'd like.
I just want to say thank you. It's very, very interesting. I have a lot of questions for myself after listening to all this. To you. I also have family in Madison, by the way.
Okay. Are you in Chicago? That looks like a Chicago skyline.
It's New York.
That's New York. Okay.
I'm in Arkansas. I just love New York.
Beautiful.
Arkansas and New York are really almost identical.
Almost.
Barely tell them apart.
I was just saying thank you. First of all, I really appreciate this discussion, and that last question that you were posing or answering, or both, about knowing what some of the root causes of suffering are in a system that's broken, and yet offering mindfulness, and the community asking for something. You use words like broader or wider. They need something maybe broader or wider. And that is an incredible tension because of the way that we get punished, even with grants or whatever, if we get too much into that wider and broader approach. But do you have any examples of how you've tried to put together what you offer as mindfulness to the community or with the community, and going into that wider, broader kind of solution, even like choices that you have made, Carmen and Dan? Does that question make sense? Because I think we're all caught in that to some degree, and maybe there's no way out. That's where the creativity develops. But I wondered how you live with that tension yourself, and if there's an example you can give of how you went wider, and also offered what it is that you very much have to offer in a more specialized kind of way.
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a great question. I can take a stab. I don't think it's going to be a satisfying answer, but it's what comes to mind. I'm working with a graduate student who's analyzing interview data from police officers who have been through our mindfulness training. And she asks them to describe mindfulness and how mindfulness shows up in their work. In the vast majority of these responses, I think these are individuals who are experiencing a lot of stress and distress and suffering, and a lot of the answers are about how it allows them to de-stress, to unwind, to self-regulate. But a lot of these answers are very much focused internally. And there are a few responses from officers where we start to see them talking about, here's how this practice shows up interpersonally. And for a very, very few examples, we start to see police officers talk about how this foundation of awareness and practices that that allow you to see your own suffering and see the suffering in other people can put you in a place where you're better able to look at that suffering in the context of systems of oppression or unjust systems. That's not the way that we taught that class at all. The way that we taught that class was we talked about it as resilience training, and we talked about this as a training to lower levels of stress and improve mental health and improve focus and things like that. And what one of the teachers, it might have been Carmen, I don't remember, it might have been Chad, who was in our discussion when we were talking about these interviews, what they talked about was when you provide people with a curriculum like this in the absence of a moral or ethical framework, they're going to fit it into whatever existing framework they have. I think the challenge for us as we move forward in that work with policing is to answer that question that you posed. How do we continue to provide these same skills of awareness and social connection and insight into the nature of the mind, and contextualize that in how can these skills then be applied in a way that they can address the injustices of this system that you're a small part of? That's a huge. I don't know how we do that, but that to me is the challenge that we need to face. And I think some of the more foundational skills of mindfulness are just that, they're foundational, and I think that's where you need to start, by developing within an individual those skills of awareness, self-awareness, and self-regulation, to be able to get people to a point, if we're talking about police officers, where you can have a conversation about race, or a conversation about bias, or a conversation about inequities in the criminal justice system, where they don't immediately go to a place of defensiveness and self-protection and, walk out the door and not come back.
Yeah. And Stella, I'm so glad you brought that question up, because I think that really is the tension of doing what we believe is important work in the world of mindfulness, but without jeopardizing. At least this is the conversation we've always had at Compassion Works for All. How do we be an advocate for social change while still being a partner with the institutions that are perpetuating that social change, or that social oppression? How do we do that without getting banned from the prisons where we work? And how do we do that without, Dan, like you said, without being creating defensiveness? I mean, Little Rock Police Department was named the most corrupt police department in America a couple of years ago, and I don't know who named them that, but it was on some publication that there was just so much corruption, so much racism. And so how do you begin to address that in a way that they're willing to listen and be receptive to? It's tough.
And I think it again comes, I'll say this quickly, and then I want to see if Carmen has a better answer than me. Question. I think it again comes from building trust, and it comes from building trust with those institutions. And after working with a police department in Madison for 5 years or 6 years, I'm starting to get to the point now where I feel like maybe comfortable enough to be able to have more difficult conversations. But I think in the big picture, the work that it is that we're trying to do is and will be for the benefit of all. And I think having developed those trusting relationships with people on both sides, if we need to think of this as being an issue where there are sides,
right.
Once you get to that point, it becomes possible at least to have those conversations. So you still have to start with building trust and attending to the needs of that organization and the individuals within the organization. And just move slowly, which is so hard to do. Things are so broken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the question, Stella, and I know we need to finish, but I just want to just say quickly a couple of examples, because with the police officers, for example, one time Dan and a couple of other colleagues and myself, we went to observe the academy, the new recruits and when they started. And to me, that time, it became clear that maybe it's mindfulness-based interventions and it needs to be something else, because I could see, for example, in that right there, you have the 50 new officers. You can have a mindfulness module, but you can also sprinkle mindfulness all over the other ones, the tactics, the conflict resolution, all the other, I don't even know the names of the other modules that they train in. But from the very beginning, kind of planting seeds right there. And the other example is in this project that Dan was talking about with people who have been previously incarcerated. Last Wednesday, actually, one of the women who was the first one who spoke, she says, well, what we need to do is to offer different ways to support people on daily living skills. And she says, like a menu in a way. And then we talked about the same thing, maybe cooking classes, but maybe with that awareness, with that compassion, with that believing and respecting the person who wants to learn about cooking or gardening or whatever we may be talking about. So it's kind of like, yes, the mindfulness there, but it has to be embedded in kind of like this wider compassionate relational awareness.
Yeah. And just the idea of eliminating suffering is what in our conversation at Compassion Works for All, that's what we keep finding ourselves circling back to, that suffering takes so many forms. And if that's really our goal, that we can't limit ourselves just to helping people reduce stress. We have to recognize the causes of stress, where that comes from, and really be active in finding ways to help reduce that. Even as simple as we got a call yesterday from the public defender's office, and there's someone trying to get from a rehabilitation facility to a sober living facility, but her car is almost out of gas. And so she can't get there. And if that were me, I would drive to the gas station and fill up my tank and keep going. But for her, that's an insurmountable obstacle that is standing in the way of getting to the sober living facility where she needs to be. And so even just understanding what an obstacle looks like, understanding what looks like something that is going to prevent me from actually taking productive steps forward in my life, all of those things I think have to be incorporated into how we move forward with our work, if we're really serious about reducing suffering. So, hey, we figured it out, team. It's 1:03 and we solved it. We found the answer.
I just wanted to say I love that image of sprinkling mindfulness in other places, sort of in a wider context, than just that. I mean, it's already an enormous focus, mindfulness, but just to look beyond that one place where you're used to looking and to kind of sprinkle it around. That metaphor works as well as any other.
That's so good.
I wanted to just say thank you. And Corey, again, you've done a wonderful, masterful job of bringing incredible guests. And I wish I could take a magic flying leap into your world. I spent a lot of time at University of Wisconsin and at Deer Park. Eshe Zopa was one of my teachers outside of Madison. And I am so happy at the seeds that you are planting in Madison and in the prisons there. It makes me so happy that people are getting to experience the benefits of your wisdom. And I love the conversation that the three of your wisdom minds and hearts had of sharing together your wide open views, that there were no limits in your willingness to explore, that human beings are vast and they have little glitches. And the three of you are willing to open to your glitches and to say to others, yes, I accept you just as you are. And if that's what you can give to people, permission to say to others, I think that is an incredible gift that you are giving to everybody that you touch, beyond the mindfulness, beyond the academia, beyond the programs. You are giving great gifts to everybody you're with, and I thank you. It was a great program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Dan and Carmen, Anna is the founder of our organization, and she's been doing this work since, I think since I was in 5th grade, actually.
I'm an old person.
But Anna, it's great to hear from you. Thank you. Well, Dan and Carmen, my goodness, this is, I have been very excited about this conversation, and this was even better than I thought it was going to be. And so, man, thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you for your work. And I look forward to following, to keeping up with what your research is showing. Is there a place where we can read about what you're doing or keep up with what you're doing?
Our general website for the Center for Healthy Minds is centerhealthyminds.org. So there may be occasional updates there on this work as it moves forward. At least the work with police, we've published a few academic papers at this point, so you can find some of that work there. But just reach out to me.
Yeah.
I'm happy to connect and talk more and answer questions and have more conversations.
Absolutely.
And Carmen has a website.
Okay, you have a website, Carmen?
Yes, it's just mindfulness.net.
Hey, that's good. Okay, excellent. Oh man, guys,
And I
thank you
hope we
so
can
much.
continue to have these conversations more,
Yeah.
all of us. All of
Yes,
us.
I would love it.
Really.
I would love it. I guess we're all best friends now, and so we're just going to keep
It
doing
feels
that.
like
Yeah. Oh, this is so wonderful. Thank you for being encouraging and uplifting. And best of luck on your work. And I'll certainly be in touch with you both.